Great. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Evan Sluter. I'm a research scientist at a company called IBHS, or the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. I study the impact of wildfire on the built environment. And prior to my time at IBHS, I've worked as a fire protection engineer here in Oregon and in New Zealand as well. And prior to that, I studied wildfire flame spread with the U.S. Forest Service at the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Montana. I am based in Portland, Oregon, but our research facility for IBHS is based in Richburg, South Carolina. I slide to go here. So starting off, a bit of background about IBHS for those of you that haven't heard about us. We are an independent, nonprofit scientific research and communications organization. We are supported by insurers and reinsurers, and using our state-of-the-art facility equipped with the capability to replicate severe weather like hurricanes, wind-driven fires, ember storms, hail impacts, and wind-driven rain, we identify aspects of the built environment that are vulnerable to severe weather. Our mission at IBHS is to take our science and translate it into action so we can prevent avoidable suffering, strengthen our homes and businesses, inform the insurance industry, and support thriving communities. So getting into structure or home hardening. Mitigation measures for structures are aimed at reducing the likelihood of ignition through two primary mechanisms. We want to reduce the exposure intensity that a home or structure would experience from a fire, and we want to increase a structure's fire resistance. So we increase the structure's fire resistance by hardening the building's exterior envelope to wildfires and exposures, and those exposures include radiant heat, direct flame contact, and ember attack. The image that I'm showing here is from one of our shed burns, and this is an ignition due to radiant heat. So the heat from that fire is strong enough that you get combustible gases forming on the surface of our structure there. And with a pilot, either from an ember or the surface just reaching its auto ignition temperature, we can get ignition, that type of fire. So the intensity of these exposures can vary significantly due to the available fuel, whether it's man-made or vegetation, the weather conditions, and the local topography. A key component of home hardening is making sure we reduce the potential exposure intensity through practices like creating defensible space and introducing what we call zone zero. The graphic that I'm showing talks about the two important knobs we turn when it comes to the structure hardening. And as I previously said, we want to reduce exposure while simultaneously increasing resilience. Individually, these methods are much less effective at preventing home ignitions and losses than if we do them simultaneously. So some key building components in the exterior envelope we focus on include the roof, exterior walls, windows, eaves, soffits, and vents. Also very important are adjacent building features like decks, fences, and outbuildings. One thing that we've identified as a key component of our dispensable space is zone zero. We talk about it a lot. I'll bring it up a few times today. This is the first 0 to 5 feet surrounding a structure. We know that embers accumulate in this area during a wildfire scenario, and they have a potential to ignite combustibles, which then have a significant impact on the structure. They can provide very high radiant heating and direct flame contact, which even the best, most resilient building materials that we have struggled to deal with. Now, when we think of structure hardening, it's common to associate the practice with building code requirements, specifically, not sure how much work everyone does in California, but with Chapter 7A, the California Building Code. In the fire community, this is one of the most established codes for home hardening and just choosing materials and construction methods for exterior wildfire exposures. I won't go through any of the requirements of Chapter 7A, but I would want to talk about how it's really important that we understand how building materials we select for this type of use are tested and how they're determined to be appropriate. Specifically, I'll go through some language used in Chapter 7A and other things like IWE code, and look at the material testing through ASTM, UL, or State Fire Marshal testing methods that kind of give us this rating, and compare that to the exposures that we see in a wildfire scenario. So despite the fact that codes are used to evaluate building materials, there's definitely some misconception around the evaluation of material performance. While materials meet code requirements, the testing required is not driven by measured exposures experienced in real fire scenarios. Codes and standards have also done a great job in the past of increasing fire safety in compartment fire scenarios, internal fires. But wildland fires are fundamentally different and can cause issues when we apply the same code requirements. We've seen this where in different scenarios, installing a fire-rated external wall or something along those lines can really create a feeling of safety in a wildland fire exposure scenario when that's not always the case, and there's some nuance to these exposures that isn't accounted for in these test methods and things. So some key language used for building materials in the code I have up here is fire resistance rating, non-combustible materials, ignition resistant materials, and fire retardant treated wood. I want to talk specifically about fire resistance rating and ignition resistant materials just to give some of the clearest examples of this disconnect. So fire resistance is given in hours. I'm sure most of you have worked with this before. It's a common misconception that this is how long the wall will last against a fire exposure, but each assembly is generally used to, it's a comparative test method. So a 1 hour versus a 2 hour wall doesn't mean that, you know, there's a 60-minute difference in the performance in a real fire scenario, but there is a 60-minute difference in the performance, at least a 60-minute difference in the performance in the test method. And these walls were created, walls, doors, windows, wall assemblies to protect occupants evacuating, key structural components, and firefighters working on a fire. So this is the ASTM E119 furnace. Wall assembly is built on the open side of the furnace here, and we'll run a time temperature curve on there, and the wall assembly gets its rating based on how long it is able to meet the standard requirements for passing while it is up against that wall. So starting off giving some examples of where these wall systems haven't performed. And it's not a large dramatic fire scenario where these vulnerabilities are shown. My colleague Malaj Banya ran these experiments because he was interested in the detailing of some external wall systems that were, the top one was a fire-rated, 1 hour fire-rated wall. It's a one-way system from the exterior exposure. But there is on the bottom side a gap for ventilation behind the wall system. And with a low intensity mulch fire, it was observed that there's a vulnerability at the bottom of this wall system, which can lead to ignition of the sheathing, which then is capable of rapidly spreading throughout the wall system. Same thing with an aluminum non-combustible exterior wall system. That low and slow mulch fire was able to create an exposure that heated the wall system to the point that the sheathing behind was able to ignite. So these are two just kind of cherry-picked, I would say, kind of examples, but it's just these materials that have been tested and approved and sometimes even detailed for 1 hour fire resistance rating aren't accounting for every type of exposure that can occur in a wildfire scenario. And we do have these vulnerabilities that we should consider, especially in the case of, you know, I've installed this non-combustible or 1 hour fire rated wall system on the exterior of my building. I'm not very concerned about my small plant or my mulch that's coming up to the base of my house. I've installed this robust system I'm expecting to perform. But as you can see, there's still risk there. In this scenario, this is from one of our more recent experiments where we're investigating structure flame spread. But this is a ADU, and the internal wall systems are all 2A 1 hour rated walls. But our external wall covering was wood siding. And we were able to measure very, very significant heat fluxes, as you can imagine, off of this system. So just kind of highlighting the fact that, when we are considering these structures, and maybe when you view it from an external perspective, fire rated walls containing a fire from one structure and protecting an adjacent property or adjacent structure on the property or a neighboring structure, exterior wall coverings can pose a pretty big risk even when we have these fire rated internal walls. Next, moving on to ignition resistant materials. These materials are tested using the Steiner tunnel test. To give some perspective, materials are mounted horizontally under this burner configuration with a slight airflow through the test chamber. And a continuous flame is imposed on these samples. And as the test progresses, the flame spread rate is measured on these samples, and an index is given based on the rate of flame spread. So this is a good test method, is a good comparison of materials, and helps. It actually helps solve a major problem of rapidly developing internal fires that not only caused rapid flame spread internally, but produced a lot of nasty smoke and things that were extremely dangerous to occupants. But labeling building materials as ignition resistant, and then kind of using that in a wildfire scenario where we know that if a home ignites, there's a very high chance that we'll see a total loss of the structure. So this test doesn't provide a lot of comparison around whether or not materials are susceptible to a specific type or of ignition or a certain vulnerability, but it rather provides just a flame spread index kind of comparative method of how fire would spread up a wall or across the ceiling, which is more applicable to an internal fire environment. Right. So our research on home hardening utilizes what we know from codes and standards, but is also a result of our unique fire testing capabilities at IBHS, our post-disaster investigations, and collaboration with the fire service. We've been able to test full-scale structures, including these discussed materials, and mimic what homes experience during a wildfire. Our observations from these tests have been used to create the Wildfire Prepared Home Standard, which is a voluntary designation program in California and now in Oregon, to meaningfully distinguish a property from an unmitigated or partially mitigated property. This standard is a holistic approach that considers exposures from embers, direct flame contact, and radiant heat, all that structures experience during fire. I'll go through some of our testing and demonstrations videos and our recommendations for key components of the exterior building envelope. So you'll notice there's a couple different colors on the screen here regarding 2 different levels of our standard. We have Wildfire Prepared Home Base, which addresses ember exposure exclusively. So we know that ember ignitions are the most prolific cause of structure ignitions in wildfire. And we don't need to do an entire retrofit of external building materials to address the risks that come from ember exposures. We can do a lot by addressing defensible space, zone 0, and the roof of a structure. Our Wildfire Prepared Home Plus standard, which is in the blue there, addresses exposures from direct flame and radiant heat that may come from an adjacent structure fire or vegetation fire nearby. And the reason we have two levels to the standard is from a retrofit perspective, base is much more approachable, much more achievable, also from a cost perspective. And it does make a significant difference in a home's risk to fire exposure and ignition from ember attack. And I'll kind of talk about this a little bit more, and I'll provide a link and a little plug at the end for where you can go to look at the technical standard for both of these and compare and have a look if you're interested. All right. So I'm going to go back before we continue on. I want to talk about zone 0 again. It is, I think, just crucial to reiterate how important defensible space and particularly zone 0 is. One way that I've talked about this, and I think has helped kind of explain how we view it and why it's so important, is zone 0 is essential just to give building materials a chance to perform and provide that fire resistance that we're hoping to get by using resistant building materials. Without zone 0, and when we get direct flame contact and significant radiant heating directly adjacent to the building, it's really challenging to have a realistic or achievable solution that is resistant to fire exposures. So this is a quick video just meant to show how quickly these types of exposures can develop. This is in our laboratory. We're capable of putting smaller, more vegetative representative vegetation like embers on structures. And on the left side, we have an unmitigated structure, one of our worst case scenarios, combustible mulch, wooden deck, cedar shake siding. And on the right, not one of our wildfire prepared home mitigated structures. So within a minute or within, I guess, 40 seconds of ignition, it's a rapidly developing fire. And this is a product of course, the materials igniting, but also the wind coming out of our fan array. You can just see that within a minute, it's an incredibly substantial fire. And the structure would be a total loss at that point. And to kind of give some perspective on this type of exposure, this level of ember attack is not considered extreme. This footage is from a homeowner that we met while we were in Lahaina investigating. When we have structure ignitions, the size of embers that come off of these materials are quite large and incredibly dense in just the intensity of this exposure is very significant, and implementing our zone 0 particularly and our other mitigation measures are crucial for making a difference when we're getting this type of exposure. All right, so getting into our exterior building envelope, start off with walls. So on our walls, we focus on, for our base, we're just worried about ember exposure, a 6-inch vertical non-combustible zone. So 6 inches from where the wall connects with at ground. We measure 6 inches up, and we want that to be non-combustible. It's for a couple reasons, but one is what we see here. This is a time lapse of our ember generators on a structure. And you can see that some of the embers just fall and land right at the base of the house. If there are any combustibles there, mulch, plants, anything else that may have been left, it provides something for those embers to ignite and can cause significant heating to the underside of that wall system, like we saw in the LODS experiments. If that area is non-combustible, we only have to worry about the embers. It's less likely we're going to get significant enough exposure to deal with that. This is also another kind of reason or way to talk about our zone 0. This recirculation, these eddies we see on the front of our structure, they cause embers to kind of circulate and go outward to approximately 5 feet. Some of our wind engineers say it's about half the height of the building, but as those embers come back out away from the structure, they catch on any material that might be there and have a high chance of igniting it. So it's another example of where, a small shrub or bush in that area can end up posing a significant risk. And then with our plus standard we're worried about, we also consider the exterior envelope experiencing radiation and direct flame contact. So we're just looking at creating a fire resistance material that can withstand some heating, while also trying to reduce as much heating as it could experience by moving structures and other combustibles away from the building. Like I showed in our earlier image there. This is a shed at a 20-foot separation, I believe. All right, so moving on to roofs and gutters. So we focus a lot on roofs at IBHS. They take a beating in all forms of extreme weather, and they're a key point of homes' resilience. Oops, sorry. Mouse got away from me there. So when we think about exposure to roofs, we're considering embers accumulating on them against different combustibles that have accumulated in roof valleys or in gutters or under solar panels and things like that. So we want to make sure that we keep them as clean as possible. But with a Class A roof, this is a test method that actually does a pretty good job of addressing heat penetration from combustibles that have accumulated on roofs. So we're pretty good there. We also recommend non-combustible gutters. As I'll show in the video coming up, combustible gutters have the ability to ignite, directly exposing the roof deck after they've ignited. And there we go. But yeah, so with Class A roofs, we're actually able to see this type of debris accumulation on roofs, and they'll perform pretty well. But on the flip side of that, with cedar shake or other combustible roof systems, we see some major issues with ignition. And then also, they're a big cause of fires to spread. When we get combustible or wood roofing, they'll ignite and they're already in an elevated position. So they have a propensity to kind of blow off downstream. And it's been observed in a number of wildfires that the presence of cedar shake roof results in not only a high likelihood of the structure with that roof to be lost, but then for every one house with a cedar shake roof, on average, 10 houses downstream will also ignite due to the presence of that roof and the amount of embers that it creates. Vents, so another ember exposure scenario. So just a possible entry point into the building where embers have the ability to get in and ignite whatever might be in your attic or garage or any other space where a vent is present. And our goal here is to maintain that ventilation while reducing the chance of ignition. So we recommend an 1/8 of an inch mesh. What you saw in the video there was a 1/4 of an inch. With an 1/8 of an inch, we do see embers still able to come into the building and come through. But what they'll do is they'll end up getting caught in the vent. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but like these embers here, and they'll sit there and burn until they're small enough to go through the vent opening. But after they've gotten in at an 1/8 of an inch, they don't have enough energy to ignite. Most things that we've tested, like in our experiments, we use cotton pads, so pretty susceptible to ignition, but they're not able to ignite those materials. So that's our sweet spot, our recommendation there. Eaves and soffits. So in addition to the requirements for vents, we recommend eaves being closed or protected on the underside by non-combustible or ignition-resistant materials, or materials approved for 1-hour fire resistance rated construction. So the reason we are interested in enclosing eaves is that when we get adjacent fires or adjacent structures burning is an area that we've observed the first failure in a lot of our experiments. So these exposed eaves just kind of trap heat and flame underneath of them and are vulnerable to ignition. Oops. With these high heat exposures, failures of windows permit embers and flame intrusion. So multi-paned windows with tempered glass are a big plus. These high heat exposures have the ability to melt the vinyl frames, which can cause panes to just fall out before even breaking. So having that second layer of protection prevents heat going in. And that first pane really helps ensure that second pane is going to stay intact. This is an exposure from one of our higher wind scenarios. It's a unique failure of a window where cold panel falls out. So in these types of scenarios, this is a 50-mile-an-hour wind with a very high fuel load upstream. And it just goes to show, like, these are some of our better windows that we've ever tested. High end of the vinyl window that you can get for fire resistance. But there is just a threshold at which where we're seeing a really high heat exposure and wind pressure that we're going to see failure. So kind of just going back to the point, building materials have a threshold where even if we're investing and putting as much as we practically can into protecting our structure, in this scenario, the only way to prevent this kind of failure is to reduce that fire exposure. Exterior building features. So decks, as I talked about before, these exterior building features, they're directly adjacent to the structure. Combustible materials, there's some work to be done in order to make sure that these aren't vulnerabilities. In this case, a lot of combustible mulch, other combustible materials under a deck, and ember ignition causes a chain of events that leads to rapidly growing fire and a very significant exposure to the building. So some of our key requirements for decks, we recommend, we require that zone 0, that non-combustible area, extend 5 feet beyond the deck. So that just removes all the combustibles from under the building and under the deck there. Decks under 4 feet have to be enclosed with 1/8 of an inch mesh, so preventing embers from getting in there from anything that might have been able to accumulate. And these really just help prevent this ignition of this deck structure, which leads to this exposure. Fences. So fences can act like a wick to a structure. So this home actually meets, or this structure meets our zone 0 requirements. Kind of gives some perspective on the potential of these fires, even when they are meeting our recommendations. So what you'll see is at the 5-foot mark away from the home, the combustible fence will switch over to non-combustible. And that just prevents that fire from being able to get directly up adjacent to the structure and expose it. And finally, outbuildings. So these adjacent structures provided a lot of really good insight for us when it comes to understanding vulnerabilities of not only structures and different building components, but moving into community wildfire vulnerabilities and looking at more of a neighborhood scale. And really understanding where's the threshold of structure to structure spacing where we think building materials start to make a difference. So to put it kind of in an overview, simple way, we've categorized damage based on my colleague Faraz and his talk with, we analyze a lot of CAL FIRE DINS data, which is post-fire incident data, kind of look at what leads to structure loss, what is key component failures, and can identify when we look at post-disaster scenarios, what happened, what was total loss, what could have been total loss, and then severe damage, minor damage, and no damage were financially determined. So severe damage was had to get a contractor involved. Minor damage is DIY type of damage, but potential total loss is an opening that embers or flames could have gone in, and total loss was a total loss of our target structure or a significant ignition that would have required firefighting intervention. And what we really see from this graph and this set of tests that we ran is that at a 10-foot separation distance between a shed and a structure with the shed ignited, there was no scenario in which our target structure wasn't at a risk or wasn't going to be a total loss. So it was regardless of what building materials we had on the target structure, what different resistance strategy we used, at a 10-foot separation distance, we're seeing a total loss. But when we got to a 20-foot separation distance, there was a very significant variation in our results. And we start to see things like building materials and different mitigation strategies make a huge difference in the outcome of the test. So this is encouraging in the sense of, all right, it's good to know that at 20 feet, we can really start to make an impact and our efforts are making a big difference. But at 10 feet, it just means we have to change our strategy. And in high density neighborhoods or communities, you have to view it as a single unit of structures. Preventing fire from getting into that unit and ignition is really important. And it informs your mitigation strategy and how you approach that design scenario. So we're working on the next phase of this project, which includes increasing our structure sizes and wind speeds and starting to look at more extreme fire scenarios like the Lahaina fire, and trying to understand the level of exposures that we're getting from these types of fires and if this separation distance or holds true or if it increases with fuel size and wind speed or things along that nature. This is kind of a very simplistic view of our results. There's a lot of measurements and power dynamics that goes into this analysis as well, but this puts it very plainly in a way of how we're seeing these results. So kind of coming back and wrapping up my talk today about mitigation. We are continuously working to understand resilience to different fire exposures, but we know that our program, what we've learned, meaningfully distinguishes structures when they're able to take on this holistic approach to resilience. And wrapping it all up. When we are able to use both increased resilience through improved building materials and defensible space, we're able to turn both those knobs and really come up with a not only achievable but practical solution in a lot of cases for not only new construction but retrofit environments. So really encourage you to check out our standards at wildfireprepared.org. The technical standard is unfortunately kind of buried. So particularly with this audience, just wanted to explain that if you go to our website, there's a lot of resources for homeowners, which is the current target audience for Wildfire Prepared. But if you scroll all the way to the bottom of the page, our technical standard is available there. All this information is free and available. And I would definitely recommend checking it out. Yeah. Thanks so much for your attention. I would love to take any questions, have a bit of a discussion, get some feedback from you all. But yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
I have a question. If you're talking about the windows failing, did you test windows other than vinyl windows, like aluminum clad wood windows or all aluminum windows, etc.?
Yes, we have tested aluminum windows. They are effective, and the aluminum is much more resilient than the vinyl. One of the feedback, like some feedback we get with the aluminum windows, though, is that for most people, they are just not achievable due to a price point issue. But
Right.
they
Have
are.
you also tested? It's very common in the industry to have wood windows that have an aluminum cladding on the outside for weather and other protection. I would assume those would perform pretty well as well, because the aluminum is the only thing that's
exposed. We haven't, to my knowledge, tested aluminum clad wooden windows. My intuition is that I agree with you that they would perform well. It would take a very significant exposure for that aluminum to heat up enough to impact that wood internal component.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
I've got a few.
Yeah, go for it.
In the zero zone that you identified, are there any other strategies besides, gravel or concrete, 5 feet within the building? Like, I mean, I'm thinking of somewhere you could use river rock or landscape rock that looks more attractive than just a 5-foot swath of gravel around the building. But even that is a bit austere. Are there other options that you've seen be effective for creating that zone of protection without it looking quite so severe?
Yeah, so we did have a design competition with some students out of Berkeley. There were definitely some good designs out of that. A lot of it involved river rock or other kind of non-combustible. So everything that's coming to mind now is some variety of stone. But as long as it's non-combustible, there's no requirement.
Are those student submissions somewhere visible for creative?
They are. They're on our on the wildfireprepared.org website. I think.
Is it under anything in particular?
I'm sorry?
Is it under a particular tab to find that information?
It is a banner currently on the top of the website that you can click on.
Okay, that's great.
And I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space for us to get out and get more kind of input. As a research organization with scientists and engineers, this is definitely not our strong suit. So yeah, would love to get as much input and help as possible.
Well, if we have a project we're working on that we want to protect, and if we come up with an idea, we'll be happy to share it, but we'll also look for inspiration in what you guys already have.
Perfect.
We did have someone in the chat ask about what about fiberglass windows?
Good question.
That is a good question. I'm not positive. I'm hesitate to make a guess on that one. Or one of the problems our lab has had is actually sourcing these windows. A lot of manufacturers have a production on the West Coast and a production on the East Coast, since the requirements are different. I think it's like a thermal related issue. But we actually have to get a buyer on the West Coast to supply our windows and then drive them all the way to South Carolina. So it has been a challenge to test practical windows. Yeah, unfortunately. And manufacturers don't love to hear that we're planning on putting their products in this type of environment. So Yeah, it can be challenging.
I have more questions, but I don't want to monopolize this talk. So are there any others that are waiting in the ranks?
I had a question. You kind of touched on like an air gap, but behind cladding materials, rain screen assemblies are common practice in the industry. Have you
Right.
guys looked at how the size of that air gap can um, have an effect on, the chance of embers catching the sheathing behind it?
We haven't. That is definitely something we're interested in doing, though. One of our needs on that project at the moment is just sourcing detailing that people are interested in us testing.
Mhm.
So I would really appreciate, I mean, I'm not sure if anyone's interested in sending me just like some external wall details with that specified. We have a full fabrication team on site who can just create experimental setups for us. But that's not something we've investigated, and that project had an initial test period and then kind of sputtered just because there's actually only 3 of us on the fire research team. So yeah, I mean, but that would be something that would be greatly appreciated if you or anyone here is any systems they're curious about or are interested in us testing. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
So most rain screens have a insect screen at the bottom to prevent insect entry into a 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch ventilation cavity. So per your talk, I would imagine you'd want maximum 1/8 inch openings in that screen material, and you'd want it to not be fiberglass. You'd want it to be metal screening,
Right.
to try to protect embers from getting in. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
There's another thing in the chat says the design competition strategies on the website seem to prioritize single-family residences. Do you consider multifamily explorations for future competition projects?
Absolutely. So due to so I guess due to our members' interest, we're prioritizing single family at the moment. But the plan is to expand to multifamily and also to commercial recommendations. We do have commercial recommendations. They're very similar to our residential. I think there's just an extra section on roofs for commercial buildings just because of flat top buildings with different services up there can cause some vulnerabilities. But it's a lot of the same, removing combustibles, things like that. But that being said, yes, and there is definitely more interest in doing more design competitions as the program expands to Oregon. We're definitely interested in kind of raising awareness and doing whatever we can to get that input.
She says thank you. Any other questions?
One more. So
Sure.
you talked, I'm really glad you touched on roof or attic venting. I've heard that ember infiltration is a major source of ignition inside of attics.
Absolutely.
And a lot of attics are vented on the soffit side and on the top side, either with mushroom vents or continuous ridge vents. And we're seeing now manufacturers coming out claiming that they have fire safe vents. I'm guessing it just means that they're 1/8 inch screen or something like that.
There is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, so that's question one, but question two is, in architecture, there's kind of two different, well, there's multiple types of roofs, but one is we call a hot roof, which is where essentially you don't ventilate the roof, you use a foam product to prevent condensation and issues that ventilation is intended to mitigate. And in so doing, you don't need ventilation at your soffits or at the top of the roof. And we certainly considered that for projects where we're in a wildfire area, because you would pretty much eliminate all of that venting. Is there any reason why you would want venting that we haven't thought of in this scenario? Like, is it a reasonable conclusion that if you can eliminate venting altogether, it's even better than going to 1/8 inch screen?
Yeah, I mean, from a fire perspective, if you're reducing an opportunity for embers to enter the building, it's a plus. Yeah, absolutely. Touching on the vent manufacturers. So, I can't remember the specific number, but there is an ASTM standard now for fire resistant vents. And it addresses ember and flame intrusion. Most of these vents are intumescent. So when they reach a certain temperature, the intumescent activates and closes all the vent openings. We have never seen one actually perform as intended.
Oh boy.
The test method is yeah, it's one of those things that's just not super applicable to a real fire scenario. So I think there is some work to be done there on those, but corrosion resistant 1/8 inch mesh is great, I think. Yeah. That is the vents though. So in the CBC, depending on where all your projects are, that is an important consideration because the fire resistant vents might be a requirement. It's not something I can remember off the top of my head, but that is, I'm not sure we allow for either to be used in our standard, but CBC may require the fire resistant vent.
Are there any I know you can't endorse manufacturers, but are there any manufacturers or particular products that are made for this that have tested well for roof ventilation to prevent embers?
Not that I can remember, but if you send me an email, I'm happy to follow up on that.
Great. Okay.
Do you ever recommend fire shutters? I've got a project we're doing in the Dalles, and it's on at the top of a slope, which is exactly what you don't want. And it's some of it's off their property. And so on that side with more severe exposure, we were just going to have fire shutters in addition to a non-combustible wall. And we're using ICF and stucco and, sealing the soffits in a metal roof and, all the things we can. But
right.
Do you ever test fire shutters? Do you ever work with those?
I mean, if you're able with fire shutters, the biggest issue is usually deployment. So it's definitely something if the homeowner feels that they're able to utilize them in that scenario, I'm not sure what that'll look like in terms of on a red flag morning day, they just go close them every day. Because with a lot of these types of, manual mitigation systems, that tends to be the issue. But another line like fire shutters would be great. I mean, reducing that vulnerability for window failure, especially it sounds like with the exterior wall construction methods you're using, the window would be the weak link, or any other opening they're covering with the fire shutter. So if the homeowner feels that, or they're able to implement that solution, I'd say it's worthwhile.
Okay. Yeah.
But I mean, in a lot of post-fire scenarios, we hear firefighters that are doing house cleanup will just be closing fully open windows of houses where people have evacuated. So it's just a difficult human behavior aspect of the problem. Garage doors, people left wide open. windows, things like that.
Knowing my clients, they would probably hunker down. We're building a
Mm.
bunker.
Okay.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Evan. This is very
Yeah, of course.
informational. And if you're okay with it, I'm gonna post the recording on our website for people to go back and watch. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, that's great. Absolutely.
And we can probably put a couple links of these links with it too, so they can follow up.
Absolutely. Yeah, happy to for folks to email me if you have any other questions. I'm not sure I can support a design process, but for nuance, things, I'm happy to chat and yeah, like to stay involved with this community because I think, you guys are actually making things happen. So it's really nice to stay involved. So yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. And have a good rest
Okay.
of your evening.